Thanks for having us, Bill. We appreciate it. Bill Carlson asked us to join you all to talk a little bit about the history of the Bay and its development. And Rodney and I wrote a book about 5 years ago now, 4 years ago, that focuses on that. And the reason that we picked that is there's some great history books on Tampa that speak to the uplands and the different events and times and periods. But there wasn't really anything focusing on the Bay, how it developed to what it is today. And we got into this project and came up with a pretty good outline that speaks of the prehistory and recent history and gets us up to what you see out there today and makes a few predictions on what the future may bring based on known projects or known plans. We didn't try to use a crystal ball on that. I know a little bit about the port. No way I could have addressed the history without Rodney, so I was lucky enough to get him to join and help me with this. So we were given a time frame of about 10 minutes. So when Rodney and I were talking about that last night, he said he's going to cover about 500 years in 5 minutes. and then I'll probably put a few minutes into what you see out there in the port today and how it got here, and then maybe a few predictions on the future. So, Rodney?
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you all so much. If it's 500 years in 6 minutes, I hope you all don't mind. But not, obviously, our book is about water and the waterfront. But really, Florida history and Florida's kind of story is one of water. And so sometimes it's too much water, sometimes it's not enough water. But water is a real central part of the overall Florida story. And even going back before there were people, before there were land animals, Florida at one point, several million years ago, was covered with water. Maybe a little bit of the ridge, the Bricksville Ridge was exposed, but for the most part, the entire Florida Peninsula and Panhandle were underwater. And that's important because of the sea creatures that were swimming around over Florida, in a sense. After they died and they kind of fell to the bottom of the sea, and millions of years passed, they, with other elements, turned into phosphate. And so the phosphate industry that we have exists in part because of the geological history of Florida and the fact that Florida at one point was underwater. When we finally have a peninsula, that's somewhat recognizable. Again, water plays an important role in human history. And really, with the Tampa Bay area in particular, we have several different bodies of water that make up the Tampa Bay area. You've got 3 different bays, Old Tampa Bay, and then Tampa Bay, which is the largest body, and then Hillsborough Bay, which is the body of water right outside here along the Bay Shore and downtown. And then, of course, the Hillsborough River, and then other smaller rivers and creeks that all feed into the bay. And it's that water, the fresh water of the rivers and the salt water that creates this estuary, that provided a wonderful place for people to first come to. And I'm not talking about 500 years ago, but I'm talking thousands of years ago with the early native people. But those people knew the same thing that we do. Again, it's the source of fresh water and the source of food that is provided by that makes this a natural place to settle. When the Europeans arrived around 500 years ago, they found these native people here who've been living here for thousands of years. There were attempts at colonization, but that never came to pass by the Europeans. And so it really wasn't until the early 1800s that you had American or kind of European settlement in this area specifically. You had a place called Spanish Town Creek, or Spanish Town, on Spanish Town Creek, which was a creek that ran through Hyde Park, emptied into Hillsborough Bay, about where Swan Avenue is, again, settling on waterfront. So those were Cuban fishermen who were here seasonally fishing in the bay. And then that was kind of turn of between the 1700s and 1800s. And then by 1824, you have a military base that's established in what is now downtown Tampa, and that's Fort Brooke. Again, there's no accident why Fort Brooke was sited where it is. The mouth of the river, overlooking Hillsborough Bay, a good position to be particularly for ships coming in, because it was through ship travel that people really got around Florida. Overland travel was very, very difficult, and during that time, dangerous because of kind of open hostility between, at that time, Americans and Seminoles who were living in Florida. So it was much safer and just much more efficient to arrive to Florida and travel around Florida by water. And that's why almost all the settlements at that time were on the coastline. Very few settlements in the interior of Florida. The military fort provided a kind of base of operations for the military, but also a nucleus for a little town to grow just to the north, and that town became Tampa. And some of the earliest jobs in Tampa were related both to the to the fort, but also to a little nascent port called Tampa Harbor along the Hillsborough River. And it was that little harbor and the fishing that went along with that, some trade that went along with that drew more settlement here, including a man named James McKay. And James McKay arrived with his family in the 1840s, and he really was one of the first to establish any kind of major shipping in and out of Tampa. And in the 1850s, that shipping included cattle going from Tampa to Cuba. One of many connections between Tampa and Florida in general and Cuba, going back again thousands of years with native people, but really over the course of the past 500 years, there's been these incredible connections between Tampa and northern Cuba. And this was reestablished and reinforced by Captain McKay in the 1850s. By the 1880s, Tampa finally was connected overland to kind of the outside world via the railroad, when Henry Plant brought his railroad here in the 1880s. But he also, Plant brought steamships. And so it was really the steamships and the discovery of phosphate in the Hillsborough River and in the Peace Valley area south of here that really brought the port, with the modern port that we have today. First with Port Tampa City down at McDill Air Force Base, and then the turn of the 20th century, the port of Tampa that we know today. And that's really, of course, Arthur's family starts off with the McKays coming here, but really the Savage side comes with the Atlantic Coastline Railroad and Port Tampa City. And so I'll turn it back over to Arthur to tell kind of the personal and professional story of the port through you.
Thank you. Yeah, and as those ports developed, the original cattle were going out of Ballast Point, which is very, very shallow. Those were shallow draft schooners, a long pier that got out to about 10 feet of water. And then in 1886, when Plant developed Port Tampa, that brought deep water. I think it was about 22, 23 feet. And everything shifted there. The rail conveniently took everything down. And then when Plant sold to the Atlantic coastline, their competitor, the Seaboard coastline, said, we need something too. And so they started developing down here with efforts through legislation to dredge this harbor and put a phosphate terminal over here. So in 1904, I think that legislation was created and dredging started. In 1905, what is now Harbor Island, then Seddon Island, was developed. And if geographically, if you all go on what's Water Street, on this side of the Marriott, and draw a line directly east and then west and connect it with Bayshore, that was the shoreline. And everything south of that is dredged up. They say that that's about the largest dredging project in the U.S. Cumulatively over the years, it creates a tremendous amount of acreage. But it went from that to Davis Islands, which Rodney's written a book on as well, to Hooker's Point, which is not named that for apparent reasons.
William Hooker.
And then the whole, Port Sutton area, Big Bend, Port Manatee being the latest major development that started in 1972. So our port at its peak, which was 1992, was the 7th largest port in the country by tonnage. We were doing 52 million tons a year in this port and moving that on about 12,000 vessel calls a year. So it was a very, very busy port. Unfortunately, we're down about 20 million tons, and that's a whole number of things. Some you can put in the good column, some in the bad column. In the late 70s, with the Arab uprising, our government felt that they needed to give money to the Moroccans and the Jordanians and such. Well, they dug huge phosphate mines that started competing with us. Now we're moving less than half of the phosphate that we used to. Also, the Chinese have come up with that. One thing that has been really good for the community, but bad for the port, is all of our coal and oil-fired power plants have changed to liquid natural gas as a result of the fracking, making it available and cheap, unfortunately via pipeline, so not ships that used to transport that fuel. That represents over 8 million tons right there. Now, our air's cleaner, our bay's cleaner, so as a community, we definitely benefited from that. As a port, it was devastating. That was the largest U.S. flag dry bulk fleet in the country was TECO Transport. And it was beautifully balanced, bringing coal over here from the Mississippi River and sometimes from Virginia for the eastern mines, and then taking phosphate rock and fertilizers back to the Mississippi River to be distributed into the heartland for fertilizer. And that balance, once the coal and oil went away, all of a sudden it was not as efficient to take those things north, and actually gave a competitive edge to the railroad, and a lot of it went to the railroad. So a lot of shipyard jobs were lost, a lot of seagoing jobs were lost, stevedores, terminal operators, things like that. So we've gone through our trials and tribulations. The great thing is we're a very diversified port. We handle liquid bulk. We're still doing about 18 million tons. It's down to about 17 right now because of the virus. Not as many commuters. We have, since March of last year, have had no international flights, so the aviation fuel is down. Tampa fuels via pipeline the Air Force Base, which is a tanker base, Tampa International, Orlando International, and Sarasota. And so we're moving a lot of fuel. We're what's called a clean port. They're all clean, ready to burn products. There's no refineries here, so there's no crude oil here. The cruise industry obviously shut down, and that had a devastating effect on the Port Authority's financials because they own those 3 berths, but as well, all those vendors that supply, how'd you like to have a lettuce concession for 3 ships of 5,000 person capacity, feeding them 3 times a day? It's big business. It's really big business. The fuel barges that fuel them up have been dormant. That will come back. We do containers. We do a lot of dry bulk. Since we're not burning coal and recovering that fly ash and the slag from the boilers, we're now importing that. What do you use that nasty stuff for? Well, that's a big additive in concrete. It helps on the concrete strength, on the resiliency, so that's a big additive to that. And so those kind of products, we're doing a lot of, the cars have diminished, because car sales diminished, but we're very diversified, and we are down as a port about 10% because of COVID, but again, there are ports like Canaveral that are 75% cruise that are just devastated. Miami, devastated. But Port Everglades, they're a balance of cruise and containers and cargo and oil. They're doing okay. We're doing okay. Port Manatee's doing okay. So that's where we are there. I want y'all to keep an eye out too for a big threat that's coming out too, that's along the lines of the 2 that I mentioned that hurt our phosphate and our fuel. There's actually a bill that was pulled in the city council by Joe Citro proposing that they forbid all fossil fuels and the construction of any fossil fuel infrastructure by 2030. That was in his first meeting. Scientifically, it's not possible. You can't do away with that in 9 years because the technology isn't there to burn the, to create the energy and such. It'll move to that. Everybody's making a big effort, but something like that, which is apparently going to come back up in March, would shut down our airport, would shut down our port, would shut down our Air Force base. Everybody would have to sell your gas car and get a battery car, whether you can afford it or not. Everybody would have to cut their gas line to their house, and they'd go dark because TECO's only at 7% renewable energy right now. And they can't get to 100% in that time frame. They're working for it. Scientifically, they'll get there someday, but they ain't getting there in 9 years. So the things like that sound great, without a lot of thought, are very dangerous. And you're talking about the devastating effect. It's going to come back in March. It's going to be watered down, but we got to be careful because those kind of things can really hurt a lot. So on the future, I think I'm probably running off on time here, but the Port Authority is trying to add another cruise berth. There's enough demand for that. They're trying to buy some private property to extend that up to the end of Port Ybor Channel, and there's some sort of competing interests that want to do residential developments on that water. And over the years, we've got some zoning in there to try and protect that deep water for shipping. We think that the dry bulk that we have is going to continue. The fuel will slowly diminish as these renewables become more practical and cost effective. I think the containers will continue to grow a little bit. If everybody in here looks at the label on their clothes, I bet nobody will find anything made in the US. Most of it is imported. If you look at your furniture, rooms to go, that is now coming directly in here. It used to come into Charleston and Miami and Savannah and then be trucked into this area. We're now getting direct shipments. So the Port Authority's done some great things by adding gantry cranes and things to handle those ships. So I think with our diversification and our view towards the future, Tampa will be good well into the future. Those great blue collar jobs that the port employs, I think, are safe as long as we don't have any, craziness in terms of regulation and things like that. So that's all I got.
Why don't you tell us about the books behind you? We're gonna go
Right here. All right. So this is the book that Arthur and I wrote, and it's funny because we obviously have a chapter. The last chapter is about what we kind of thought about the future. But this book was written several years ago at this point, and so some of the things that we talked about as being future, potential future things, are actually come to pass. And one of them, or at least coming to pass. And one of the projects that was at its very beginnings when we started writing this was the Water Street Tampa project, and that a lot of that property that SPP is converting into this whole kind of big mixed use redevelopment was port-related property, not necessarily owned by the port, although they are operating Sparkling Wharf on port property. But the neighborhood that Water Street Tampa occupies is a neighborhood called the Garrison, and the Garrison was actually an African American neighborhood that started around the turn of the 20th century as the port began to grow. A lot of longshoremen and their families lived in this neighborhood, mostly African Americans, and there are also warehouses in that same area that all supported the port. So you had these kind of ancillary industries and these people who were working in those industries who lived in this neighborhood, and now it's being converted to this giant mixed-use project. The Garrison had kind of ceased to exist as a community by 1960s, 1970s, so most of this property was vacant when the SPP people began acquiring it several years ago. But what was then just kind of a future endeavor, as we wrote in the book, is now certainly coming to pass. And anybody who's been by the History Center, which is on Water Street, has, I'm sure, seen the incredible growth around us. And so where we didn't really have a whole lot of neighbors when we opened, I guess, 11 or 12 years ago now, we now have lots of neighbors. We're going to have neighbors living right next door to us literally in just a few months as those apartments start opening. So it's been a lot of growth in our part of the world, and former industrial land being converted. As Arthur said, you know, a lot of this property that used to be heavy industrial is now, there's competition with making it more accessible to the public, or more, you know, residential uses, and moving away from port uses. And so again, you know, we can see the benefits of that. It looks prettier, but once those buildings are built and people are living in them, the jobs that used to kind of occupy those lands are not as prevalent. And so as we have even more service-related jobs, which pay less than a lot of these port jobs, which are very high-paying blue-collar jobs. And so there is a bit of a balance that needs to be sought when we're looking at converting former port land or current port land into uses that aren't really directly related to